Caught my husband and my sister sitting in the backseat of our car in the driveway at 2 a.m., laughing about how they managed to keep their affair hidden for 10 years without me or our entire family ever suspecting anything. I was the one who cheated first. That's the part of this story nobody knows, the secret I've been carrying like shattered glass in my chest for 12 years. It started with a text from my trainer, Jake, just a simple great session today with a winking emoji, and within 3 weeks I was in his apartment, telling myself that what Marcus didn't know wouldn't hurt me. I remember staring at my wedding ring on Jake's nightstand, thinking how easy it was to take it off, how weightless my hand felt without it. I told myself Marcus had gotten comfortable, that after 8 years of marriage, he barely looked at me anymore, that I deserved to feel wanted again. The lies we tell ourselves when we're about to destroy everything. The affair with Jake lasted 4 months. 4 months of deleted texts, fake book clubs, and becoming an expert at washing another man's cologne off my skin. I became someone I didn't recognize, someone who could look my husband in the eye over dinner and ask about his day while another man's touch still lingered on my body. The guilt was suffocating, but the attention was intoxicating. Jake made me feel 25 again, made me forget about the mortgage, the fertility struggles, the way Marcus and I had become roommates who happened to share a bed. I convinced myself this was my rebellion against a life that had become too predictable, too safe, too ordinary. The night I ended it with Jake was the same night Marcus surprised me with tickets to Paris. He'd been saving for months, working overtime that I'd assumed was him avoiding me. "I know we've been distant," he said, holding my hands across our kitchen table. "I want to fix us." He got up after he went to bed, kneeling on our bathroom floor and promising God, the universe, anyone listening that I would be better. I would be the wife Marcus deserved. I would bury this mistake so deep it would fossilize. I would never see him again. For 2 years, I almost believed my performance. We went to Paris, renewed our vows on our 10th anniversary, and started trying for a baby with real hope. I transformed my guilt into dedication, became the perfect wife as penance for my sins. Marcus seemed happier, lighter, more like the man I'd fallen in love with in college. I thought I'd gotten away with it, thought I'd learned my lesson without paying the price. I even started to forgive myself, writing off the affair as temporary insanity, a momentary lapse that ultimately made me appreciate what I had. Confidant through all of it, though I never told her about Jake. She'd always been protective of Marcus, said he was too good for me in that joking way that held a grain of truth. She helped me plan the vow renewal, stayed up with me during negative pregnancy tests, and reminded me that Marcus was one of the good ones whenever I complained about something trivial. She had her problems with men, a string of relationships that never lasted more than a year. "At least you found your person," she'd say, crashing in our guest room after another breakup. Some of us are still looking. The universe has a sense of humor darker than anything I could have imagined. The night I found them, I wasn't even supposed to be home. My flight from a work conference had been cancelled, and instead of getting a hotel near the airport, I'd taken an expensive Uber home, wanting to surprise Marcus. It was 2 a.m. when the driver pulled into our subdivision. I was exhausted, dreaming of crawling into bed next to my husband, when I saw our car parked crooked in the driveway, interior light on, 2 shadows moving inside. My first thought was that someone was stealing our car. My second thought was that Marcus had fallen asleep in there, maybe from a night out I didn't know about. It wasn't until I got closer, until I heard the laughter, her distinctive snort laugh that she'd been self-conscious about since middle school, that my brain started to piece together what I was seeing. Natalie's hand on Marcus's face. Marcus's arm around her shoulders. Both of them were laughing at something on his phone, comfortable in a way that suggested years of intimacy, not a first-time mistake. I stood in my driveway like a ghost, watching them through the windshield. They were looking at photos, I realized, photos of them together that I'd never seen. Natalie was wearing my robe, the silk one Marcus had bought me for Christmas. The casual cruelty of that detail still takes my breath away. They weren't even trying to hide, weren't anxious or guilty. They were just comfortable. Happy. Together in a way, Marcus and I hadn't been even in our best moments. When Marcus finally looked up and saw me, his face went through a transformation I'll never forget. Surprise, then fear, then something that looked almost like relief. Like he was tired of hiding, tired of pretending. Natalie didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. She stepped out of the car, my robe falling open to reveal she was wearing Marcus's college t-shirt underneath, and said, "We need to talk." The story came out in pieces over the next 3 hours, told in our living room while I sat in the same chair where I'd opened Christmas presents, birthday gifts, sympathy cards when my father died. 10 years. They'd been together 10 years. It started before Jake, before the fertility struggles, before Paris. It started 6 months after our wedding, at my birthday party of all things, when Marcus drove Natalie home because she'd had too much to drink. "We didn't mean for it to happen," Marcus said, as if that mattered, as if 10 years of deception could be an accident. They had a system, a whole elaborate architecture of lies I'd never suspected. Business trips that were weekends together. Natalie's relationships that kept her single and available. The guest room she stayed in that connected to our bedroom through a bathroom I never used. They'd spent every major holiday together, every family vacation, every milestone of my life, carrying on their affair in the spaces I wasn't looking. My sister had been my maid of honor while sleeping with my husband. She'd held my hand through fertility treatments while knowing Marcus had gotten a vasectomy 3 years into our marriage because he only wanted children with her. We fell in love, Natalie said, as if that explained everything, as if that justified a decade of betrayal. Real love, not the comfortable arrangement you two had. The cruelty of that statement was surgical, designed to hit exactly where I was weakest. Because hadn't I thought the same thing about Jake? Hadn't I justified my betrayal with the same hollow reasoning? The difference was 4 months versus 10 years. The difference was between stopping versus never intending to stop. The difference was everything. Marcus had documentation. Screenshots of my texts with Jake that he'd somehow retrieved, photos a friend had taken of Jake and me at a coffee shop when I'd said I was at the gym. He'd known about my affair the entire time, had been planning to confront me after Paris, but then I'd ended it and seemed so committed to fixing our marriage that he decided to let it go. Except he couldn't let it go. The knowledge of my betrayal had eaten at him, he said, until Natalie was the only person he could talk to about it. The irony was so perfect it felt scripted. My affair had pushed my husband into my sister's arms, where he'd stayed for a decade. They wanted to come clean now because Natalie was pregnant. 3 months along, due in September. They'd been trying for 2 years, coordinating her cycle with his business trips, turning the pursuit of their child into another elaborate deception. The pregnancy was what had made them careless, giddy with their success after so many months of trying. They'd been looking at ultrasound photos in our driveway, in our car, celebrating the life they'd created while I was supposed to be 3 states away. I laughed when they told me about the pregnancy. Laughed until I couldn't breathe, until Marcus looked genuinely concerned, until Natalie touched my shoulder and I slapped her hand away so hard my palm stung. I laughed because I'd taken 3 pregnancy tests that week, all negative, marking another failed month in what I thought was our journey to parenthood. I laughed because the universe's punchline was perfect. I'd spent 2 years trying to give Marcus a baby he'd made sure I could never have, while my sister carried the child he wanted. The implosion of my life was swift and merciless. Within 48 hours of finding them in the car, I'd become the villain in my own story. Marcus had already consulted a divorce attorney, had already documented my affair with Jake, and had already prepared for this moment with the methodical planning of someone who'd had 10 years to think about it. When I tried to explain to friends, family, anyone who would listen, that they'd been together for a decade, that this wasn't just revenge for my brief indiscretion, I sounded hysterical, desperate, like a woman trying to minimize her guilt by inflating theirs. My mother was the worst. She'd always preferred Natalie, the prettier daughter, the successful one, the one who hadn't needed 3 attempts to graduate college. When I called her sobbing at 5 a.m., she listened to everything and then said, "Well, you cheated first, didn't you?" As if that math made sense, as if 4 months of wrong justified 10 years of betrayal. She was already planning Natalie's baby shower in her mind, I could hear it in her voice. She was already choosing sides, and I wasn't on the winning team. The divorce proceedings were surgical in their efficiency. Marcus had documented everything, not just my affair but every sign of what his lawyer called marital abandonment. The book club was my cover for seeing Jake. The gym membership I'd used as an alibi. The work conferences I'd extended to create space for my marriage. In the retelling, I sounded like a serial cheater, a negligent wife who'd driven her husband away. The fact that most of these were legitimate activities, that I'd only used them as covers during those 4 months with Jake, didn't matter. The narrative was established. I was the unfaithful wife who'd destroyed her marriage. I tried to fight back, hired my lawyer, and tried to expose the depth of their deception. But what evidence did I have? They'd been so careful, so meticulous. There were no texts, no emails, no credit card trails. They'd conducted a decade-long affair with the operational security of spies. Meanwhile, Marcus had screenshots of my messages to Jake, including one where I'd written "I love you" with 3 heart emojis. Out of context, without the immediate follow-up where I'd written "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that, I'm confused," it looked like a confession of deep feeling rather than a moment of weakness I'd immediately regretted. Our mutual friends chose sides with surgical precision. The couples we'd had dinner with, the people we'd vacationed with, they all seemed to have the same script. Affairs are never okay, but yours came first. Marcus was just reacting to being. At least he and Natalie loved each other. That last one was the cruelest, the implication that my affair had been meaningless while theirs was profound. Never mind that I'd ended mine, that I'd chosen my marriage, that I'd spent 2 years trying to rebuild what I'd damaged. The story was simpler without those details. I moved out of our house on a Thursday. Marcus had generously offered to let me stay until I found a place, but living there knowing they'd been together in every room, on every surface, was like sleeping in a crime scene. I found a studio apartment 40 minutes away, far enough that I wouldn't run into them at the grocery store. The landlord looked at my credit application with suspicion, a 38-year-old woman with a good job, suddenly needing a studio, clearly running from something. Social media became a chamber I couldn't stop visiting. Natalie posted ultrasound photos with captions about new beginnings and everything happens for a reason. The comments were full of congratulations, heart emojis, and people saying she deserved happiness after all her struggles with relationships. Nobody questioned why Marcus was suddenly in her photos, why my husband was suddenly her birth partner. The narrative had been rewritten. They were star-crossed lovers who'd found each other after I destroyed my marriage. Simple. Clean. Romantic, even. Jake reached out once, a text saying he'd heard about my divorce and was sorry. I stared at that message for an hour, thinking about how different things might have been if I'd never responded to his first text, if I'd never taken off my wedding ring in his apartment, if I'd chosen fidelity over 4 months of feeling desired. But that was magical thinking. Marcus and Natalie had been together for 6 years before Jake ever entered the picture. My affair wasn't the cause, it was just the excuse they'd been waiting for. The worst part was the gaslighting, though I didn't recognize it as that until my therapist pointed it out months later. The way they'd rewritten history to make me the architect of my destruction. The way they turned my 4-month mistake into justification for a decade of deception. The way they'd made me doubt my reality, question whether I was remembering things correctly, whether I was the crazy one for thinking 10 years was worse than 4 months. They were so convinced of their righteousness, so certain that my sin had absolved theirs, that sometimes I believed them. Work became my escape until it wasn't. My coworkers knew something had happened, the way you can sense when someone's life has imploded, even when they're trying to hold it together. Into projects, stayed late, volunteered for travel nobody wanted. But then Natalie started showing, and she'd post photos of her growing bump, and somehow those photos would make their way to me through well-meaning colleagues who didn't know she was my sister. "Look how cute this is," they'd say, showing me my sister carrying my husband's child, and I'd have to smile and agree. The breaking point came when I saw them at a restaurant, my restaurant, the place I'd gone every Friday for lunch since starting my job 5 years ago. They were at my usual table, Natalie glowing in her second trimester, Marcus's hand on her belly. They were laughing at something on the menu, and I recognized the joke immediately because it was mine. I'd always said the Caesar salad description sounded like a personal ad, mature romaine seeking parmesan for committed relationship. Marcus was telling my joke to my sister at my restaurant at my table, colonizing every space that had been mine. I confronted them in the parking lot. Not my finest moment, standing there in my work clothes while they walked to their car, our car, the one I'd helped pay for but wasn't mine anymore. 10 years, I kept saying, as if repetition would make them understand the magnitude of it. 10 years of lying to my face. Natalie put her hand on her bump, that universal gesture of pregnant women protecting their unborn child, as if I were the threat, as if he worries the one who destroyed our family. "You cheated first," Marcus said, his voice calm in that way that made me feel hysterical by comparison. "You broke our vows first. Everything that happened after that is on you." The simplicity of his logic was breathtaking. As if marriage was a game where the first person to break a rule forfeited all rights to anger, to betrayal. As if my 4 months of weakness gave them carte blanche for a decade of deception. "I ended it," I said, hating how my voice cracked. "I chose us. I chose our marriage." "After you'd already destroyed it," Natalie said, and there was something like pity in her voice that made me want to scream. "You can't unring that bell. You can't undo what you did just because you felt guilty afterward." They drove away in our car, to our house, to continue the life they'd built in the ruins of mine. I sat in my car in that parking lot for 2 hours, watching happy couples go in and out of my restaurant, trying to understand how I'd become the villain in my own story. The cheater. The homewrecker. The woman who'd driven her husband into her sister's arms. Never mind that those arms had been open for 6 months before I'd ever met Jake. Never mind that they'd been planning this life while I was planning our anniversary party. The story was simply their way. I cheated. I got caught. I got what I deserved. The baby was born on a Tuesday. September 15th, 3 days after what would have been Marcus's and my 13th wedding anniversary. I found out through Facebook, a photo Natalie posted of a perfect little girl with Marcus's eyes and our grandmother's nose. The caption read, "Our miracle is here," and the comments were a flood of congratulations, prayer hands emojis, and declarations that they deserved this happiness. My mother commented, "Grandmother at last." As if I hadn't existed, as if the years I tried to give her grandchildren had been erased. I put my phone across my apartment when I saw the baby's name, Sarah Jane. Sarah, after Marcus's mother, who'd passed 5 years ago, who'd held my hand at her deathbed and told me I was the daughter she'd never had. Jane, after our grandmother, who'd left me her engagement ring, the one I'd worn for 10 years, the one I'd had to give back in the divorce. They'd named their daughter after the woman who'd loved me, claimed that heritage as their own, and somehow made it seem like justice. The unraveling of my professional life was slower but just as complete. I'd always been good at my job, had always found refuge in the clarity of spreadsheets and deadlines. But the depression that settled over me after the baby's birth was like working underwater. I missed meetings, forgot deadlines, stared at screens without seeing them. My boss, a kind woman who'd been through her divorce, tried to be understanding. But understanding has limits when you're running a business, and after 6 months of subpar performance, I was put on a performance improvement plan that everyone knew was a prelude to termination. My mother called me exactly once after Sarah was born. She wanted me to know that Natalie had made her the baby's godmother, that she was moving closer to them to help with childcare, that she was selling the family home I'd grown up in to buy a condo near Marcus and Natalie's new house. "I think it's best if we have some space," she said, as if we hadn't already been estranged for months. "You need to work on yourself, figure out why you sabotaged your marriage. Maybe when you've done that, when you've accepted responsibility, we can work on rebuilding our relationship." The isolation was complete and deliberate. Every mutual friend had chosen their side, and it wasn't mine. The narrative was too compelling: the unfaithful wife who'd driven her husband away, now bitter that he'd found happiness with someone else. Never mind that someone else was my sister. Never mind that the happiness had been happening during my entire marriage. The story was simpler their way, more satisfying. Everyone loves a villain they can feel superior to. I ran into Jake at a coffee shop 8 months after the divorce was finalized. He looked good, healthy, engaged to someone age-appropriate who didn't wear a wedding ring she had to hide. He tried to make small talk, but I could see the relief in his eyes that he'd dodged the bullet of me. I wanted to tell him that our affair had been a footnote in a larger story, that Marcus and Natalie had been together for years before he'd ever texted me. But what was the point? He'd already rewritten our history, too, turned me into a cautionary tale he probably told his friends. The married woman who'd wanted more, who'd destroyed her life for a few months of passion. My therapist says I need to stop relitigating the past, stop trying to convince people of a truth they don't want to hear. Your truth, she says carefully, is that everyone betrayed everyone. But their truth, the one that's easier to live with, is that you betrayed first and worst. She's right, of course. The math of betrayal isn't objective. 4 months versus 10 years only matters if people want it to matter. And nobody wants it to matter, because the story is so much cleaner if I'm the only villain. I've started over in a new city where nobody knows my history. I tell people I'm divorced, and if they ask why, I say infidelity and let them assume what they want. Usually, they assume my husband cheated, and the sympathy in their eyes is a relief after so long being the object of contempt. I don't correct them. I don't explain that we both cheated, that the whole structure of my life was built on lies I didn't even know existed. I let them believe the simpler story, the one where I'm the victim, because I'm so tired of being the villain. Sometimes with what-ifs. What if I'd never responded to Jake's text? Would Marcus and Natalie have continued their affair indefinitely, letting me live in ignorant stability? What if I'd never come home early that night? Would they have told me eventually, or would I have spent my whole life in a marriage that was a front for their relationship? What if I'd fought harder in the divorce, hired a private investigator, and found proof of their decade of deception? Would it have mattered, or would the story have remained the same? I cheated first, I broke the sacred trust, I deserved whatever came after. But the hardest what if is this: what if I'd been a better wife from the beginning? What if I'd been enough for Marcus in those early years, before Natalie became his confidant, his escape, his real partner? The therapist says this is unproductive thinking, that Marcus made his choices regardless of my actions. But late at night, in my studio apartment with its view of a parking lot, I wonder if I created the perfect storm for my destruction. If my casual discontent in those early years, before Jake, before everything, had opened the door for Natalie to walk through. The last time I saw them was at a Target 2 hours from my new apartment. I'd driven there specifically because it was far from anywhere they'd shop, but there they were in the baby aisle, Sarah in the cart, Marcus comparing diaper brands while Natalie laughed at something on her phone. They looked like a normal family, happy, complete, untouched by the destruction they'd caused. The baby, my niece, who would never know me, reached for a toy, and Marcus immediately handed it to her with the indulgence of a besotted father. I hid behind a display of paper towels, watching them through the gaps between packages. They were discussing Halloween costumes for Sarah's first trick-or-treat, debating between a pumpkin and a ladybug. Such a normal conversation for a couple with a baby, except the couple was my ex-husband and my sister, and the baby was the proof of a betrayal so complete I still couldn't fully comprehend it. They'd built an entire life, a whole family, in the shadow of my marriage, and now they got to live it in the light while I hid behind paper towels in a Target 2 hours from home. When they finally left, I abandoned my cart and sat in my car until the sun set. I thought about following them, seeing where they lived now, what their life looked like without me in it. But I knew it would look exactly like a life should look: full, complete, happy. They'd won the narrative war. They were the couple who'd found love despite the odds, who'd overcome my betrayal to build something beautiful. I was the bitter ex-wife who'd cheated first and lost everything, a cautionary tale they probably never even thought about anymore. My therapist asks me what I've learned from all of this, what wisdom I'd share with someone else in my position. The answer changes depending on how much I've had to drink, how recently I've seen their photos online, and how lonely the night feels. Sometimes I say I've learned that the first person to break trust loses all moral authority, regardless of what comes after. Sometimes I say I've learned that there are no victims in mutual destruction, only different degrees of guilt. Sometimes I say I've learned that love and betrayal can coexist for years, feeding off each other until you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. But the real truth, the one I can barely admit even to myself, is simpler and more brutal. I learned that in the economy of betrayal, the person who gets caught first pays for everyone's sins. Marcus and Natalie's 10-year affair became my fault the moment my 4-month mistake was discovered. Their baby became my consequence. Their happiness became my punishment. The story reshapes itself around the first exposed secret, and everything else becomes justified reaction, understandable response, deserved outcome. I still wake up sometimes thinking I'm in my old life, reaching across the bed for Marcus, planning breakfast with Natalie, living in the comfortable delusion that I was loved, that I was chosen, that I mattered. The disorientation when reality crashes back is physical, a vertigo that makes me grip the edges of my single bed in my studio apartment. This is my life now, alone, discredited, erased from the family narrative like a character written out of a show. They kept the house, the friends, the family, the future. I kept the guilt, the blame, the scarlet letter that only I can see, but everyone seems to know about. The last text Natalie ever sent me was a photo of Sarah on her first birthday. The baby was smiling, cake covered, reaching toward the camera with pure joy. The message said, "Thought you should see this. Despite everything, she's still yours." The cruelty of that message, the casual acknowledgement that this child I'll never know shares my DNA, was breathtaking. But worse was the despite everything, as if I was the everything that had to be overcome, the obstacle to their happiness, the mistake that had somehow resulted in this beautiful child I'll only ever see in photos. I didn't respond. What could I say? Seeing my niece I'll never hold was? That knowing she exists because of a betrayal that started before I ever betrayed anyone was a cosmic joke I couldn't laugh at? That despite everything should include the decade of lies, the systematic deception, the fact that her parents fell in love while I was sleeping next to her father? There were no words for that kind of pain, no response that wouldn't sound like the bitter ramblings of the woman who cheated first. So I deleted the photo, blocked Natalie's number, and tried to accept the truth that my therapist keeps repeating: sometimes the person who pulls the first thread gets blamed for the whole unraveling, even if the fabric was already torn beyond repair. I was that person. I pulled that thread with Jake, and in doing so, I gave Marcus and Natalie the perfect excuse for a betrayal that had been happening for years. They got to rewrite themselves as victims who found solace in each other, while I became the cautionary tale, the cheater who lost everything, the woman who destroyed her own life for 4 months of feeling wanted. The hollow truth I live with now, the one that wakes me at 2 a.m. in my studio apartment, is this: I handed them the weapon they used to destroy me, and they wielded it with 10 years of practice.